I'm making my own way. But I stumble and I falter every day. But I love my baby now. Well, I love my baby, I'm still learning how. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Stay with me.
Hello, and welcome to Pathways to Parenting Success, our continuing series. We have a wonderful panel for you this evening. I want to first start by thanking our partners, the Boulder Valley School District and the Boulder Valley Media Alliance and Channel 22. Our topic tonight is on risk behaviors. We have four panelists who are going to discuss different elements regarding risk behaviors. We're going to start with Leisha Connors-Bauer from the Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, and she's going to be discussing the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, giving us a little overview of the results and focusing on parental influence on risk behavior. We'll then hear from Lori Benblatt, licensed professional counselor, who will be identifying signs, symptoms, and contributing factors to risk behaviors, and also appropriate responses for family members. We'll then hear from Jeremy Dion, licensed professional counselor, how family values, decision-making, and communication impact risk behaviors. And finally, we'll hear from Linda Cain, who will talk about what to do if your child is engaging in risk behavior. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, without whose assistance these free series would not be possible. The Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, the Boulder Public Library Foundation, the Boulder Valley School District, Centennial Peaks Hospital, the Parent Engagement Network, the CAMRA, Hope Coalition, and the Latino Advisory Board of Lafayette. I'm your host, Jan Hittleman, the Director of Boulder Psychological Services. Our first presenter, Leisha Connors-Bauer, is a Boulder Valley School District parent and manager of the Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance. Leisha works closely with local school districts and community agencies to provide opportunities and resources for parents and guardians to support their youth in making healthy choices. It's my pleasure to introduce Leisha Connors-Bauer.
Thank you, Jan. So what I'm going to do is kind of give a brief overview of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey using some PowerPoint slides. These are the highlights from the 2009 survey that was conducted in November of 2009. To give you a little history of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, in 1991, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey was established by the Centers for Disease Control. The Centers for Disease Control established the survey methodology, they established their criteria for weighting the data, and in 2001, the YRBS began in the Boulder Valley High Schools. In 2009, in Boulder Valley Middle Schools, and I'd like to note that that was just 7th and 8th graders were surveyed in Boulder Valley Middle Schools. The survey is given every 2 years and actually will be resurveying in the fall of 2011. In 2009, we had 3,210 usable Boulder County surveys. So we surveyed 16 middle schools, 9 high schools, and we had a 77% middle school response rate and an 80% high school response rate. The reason I'm giving you this quick overview related to the timeline of the YRBS is because what we're doing is we're tracking behaviors over time. There are certain things that we've identified in the surveys that we have seen that are challenges to our community, and so we want to see what happens within those behaviors as time progresses, and so we're able to do that by looking at these trends since 2001. So the YRBS covers 6 primary areas and looks at risk and protective factors within those 6 areas: unintentional injury, violence, mental health, sexual health, substance use, and weight and exercise. So next we're going to look at, sorry about that. We're going to share with you a little bit about the middle school data. I mentioned earlier that we surveyed 7th and 8th graders, and that we used the data to inform the prevention and intervention efforts for middle school. But an important thing to know about the middle school YRBS is the data is not directly comparable to the high school. We asked different types of questions, and the age ranges are different. Within the middle school data, I wanted to highlight for you a couple of areas that we identified as areas of concern. I think one of the biggest areas of concern within the middle school data is bullying. 42.3% of the 7th and 8th graders in Boulder Valley Middle Schools report being bullied. It was the highest prevalence rate among all the responses that received to the middle school questions. And the interesting thing about the bullying data is there's no difference between male and females, there's no difference between 7th and 8th grade, and there's no difference based on race or ethnicity. For some of the other data elements, we do see differences based on grade, gender, and race, ethnicity, but not bullying. So I just wanted to let people know, because I know that that's been a concern, particularly nationally. Some of the other things that have popped up as concerns were safety. We saw that about a quarter of the middle school students had said they had carried a weapon to school, and we also start seeing some substance use behaviors surface in middle school. But on the other hand, there are things to celebrate within the middle school data: seatbelt use, low cigarette use, screen time, physical activity, and access to AIDS, HIV education. In physical activity, the middle school students said they get at least 60 minutes per day during the 7 days preceding the survey, and 87% had regular physical activity. I think that that's something for us to celebrate, given the conversations about high obesity rates within the United States. And I know that seatbelt use might look a little odd when you see it up there, but unintentional injuries is one of the leading causes of death among adolescents. And so when we look at seatbelt use, that's just one indicator of safety measures that students are taking. So the high school level, some of the challenges and emerging issues you can see are drove after drinking, binge drinking, offered, sold, or given drugs at school, alcohol or drugs before intercourse, electronic bullying, which is a new question. That was just added within the last year as something for us to take a look at. And when I mention that these are challenges, these are items that have been, we're not comparing favorably to the Colorado and the U.S. rates. And that's what we've identified as challenges here. So the others are also self-injury, which is an intent to harm themselves without committing suicide. Used a prescription drug without a prescription, which is also a new question, and it's another issue that's really popped up nationally. And then attended school under the influence of alcohol or other illegal drugs. So these were things that popped up in the 2009 data as areas that were not compared favorably to the U.S. and Colorado as a whole. Just wanted to let you know that those are some of the things that we're looking at to change that a little bit, change that direction, and work with the community agencies and community members. On the other hand, we also have a lot of successes within the YRBS when we look at that. The top 6 items on this list is used seatbelt in a physical fight, forced sex, attempted suicide, obesity, and TV time. We see better rates than in Colorado and the United States. The last 3 items on this list had someone to talk to when sad, felt that their parents have clear rules for behavior, and ate 4 or more meals a week with their family. Those are considered behaviors that will have a protective effect on students and on youth health. The Columbia University has done quite a bit of research on this idea of family meals, and found that students who ate 4 or more family meals a week with their family are more likely to be successful in school, are less likely to participate in risk behaviors. And so I think it's great that the CDC added this, and we're also able to measure it locally. The next few slides are just sort of a quick snapshot of some of the trends that we're seeing within the Youth Risk Behavior Survey for Boulder Valley. The first one is on harassment. What you see here is a graph that's actually going in the right direction. We're seeing declines in the rate of harassment among high school students. And so that, we don't ask students, are you harassing somebody? We ask them, during the past 12 months, have you ever been harassed at school or on the way to or from school? And we define harassment as including threatening, bullying, name-calling, or obscenities, offensive notes or graffiti, exclusion from groups, unwanted attention, or unwanted touching and physical assault. And harassment has shown linkages to other risk behaviors, and so that's one of the reasons why seeing this trend go in a downward direction is really a good sign, I think, for the health of our youth. Mental health. We did a survey not too long ago, the Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, and we asked parents what they saw as the #1 issue facing teens in this community, and they identified stress. And I think you see some of that in this mental health graph, which shows you sad or hopeless, which was asked during the past 12 months, did you ever feel so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row that you stopped some usual activities? The other piece is considered suicide, which you see on here, and attempted suicide. And the question there was, how many times did you actually attempt suicide during the past year? So what we've seen is considered suicide has been in a consistent downward trend from 2003. Attempted suicide has kind of bounced a little bit, but in terms of the sad or hopeless line on the graph that you see there, we've seen very little change and very little statistical change in terms of sad or hopeless, and so that's one area that we are hoping to target over the next 3 years. The next graph talks about sexual health. So the good news in Boulder Valley schools is that the rates of ever having sex, current sexual activity, and sex before age 13 were significantly lower than nationwide in 2009, and condom use has remained steady. And you can see that condom use is on that top graph, and that has remained steady over the period of time that we've collected this data. Substance use. Substance use is one of those kind of tricky, I think, topics in that we look at substance use, and it's not necessarily it's related to other behaviors. You know, it could be a result of somebody being harassed. It could be a way a student copes with stress or other areas. And so substance use, I think, is linked to other things as well. And so it's important for us to continue to pay attention to substance use and also the conversations that we have within the community related to substance use. So the pieces that you see here, when it says current use, current is during the past 30 days, how many days did you, in this graph, drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, or use marijuana? Binge drinking is during the past 30 days, on how many days did you have 5 or more drinks of alcohol in a row within the last couple of hours? And drove after drinking is, again, during the past 30 days. Now, when we look at the binge drinking graph, we don't see a lot of change in binge drinking, but one of the things that I wanted to point out is when you see these data elements, there's 2 ways to look at this, and I think the binge drinking graph is an example of an alternate way of looking at this. You can see that approximately about between 20 and 30% of students are binge drinking, but that also means that 70 to 80% of our high school students are not binge drinking. They're not engaging in that high-risk kind of drinking that has some serious consequences to them. I also think that one of the things you see in related to binge drinking and drove after drinking is that sometimes we see changes for a year related to those areas. And sometimes those changes tend to follow a community event. If there has been a drunk driving accident that's been widely reported in the media, or if there's been something that's happened related to binge drinking, there's increased awareness about that behavior and the negative consequences that can happen as a result of that. I think the challenge for us in a community is how we sustain that awareness, particularly among youth. This next slide is on early initiation behaviors, which is before age 13, and that highlights cigarette use, alcohol use, marijuana use, and sexual intercourse, all before the age of 13. We didn't ask them, were you younger than age 13? We asked them how old they actually were when they, for instance, smoked a cigarette for the first time. This, I have to admit, is one of my favorite data points, if you can get excited about data points, in the whole part of the presentation, is because we're seeing these early initiation behaviors headed in the right direction, which is we're seeing them starting to decrease over time. One of the things, and I think maybe some of our other panelists will talk about this a little more, is that the earlier youth is, when they begin these risky behaviors, the more likely there is for consequences later on down the line. And plus I have a middle school child, and so it makes me kind of excited to see that these early initiation behaviors are headed in a downward direction. And this last piece is on student perceptions. One of the things that we did, probably I think in 2005, was we added some questions to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and we asked the students if they thought, we asked the students, how wrong do your parents or guardians feel it would be for you to smoke cigarettes? Or questions such as how much do you think people risk harming themselves physically or in other ways if they take 1 or 2 drinks of an alcoholic beverage nearly every day? And so what we're trying to measure is the students' perception of their parents' disapproval and their perception of the risk of certain substances, in this case, cigarettes, alcohol, and marijuana. And so what we see in these graphs is that the students' perception of parental disapproval is really high for cigarettes. Their perception of the risk or harm for cigarettes is also really high. It's a little less high in both of those instances for alcohol and marijuana. And I think that you can see in the marijuana graph that we've actually seen a statistically significant decline in the marijuana perception of risk for between 2007 and 2009. So one of the interesting things is there's been research that shows that if students are aware of their parents' feelings on the use of these substances, it influences their behavior as well. It influences their perception of risk. It influences whether they think it's wrong for someone their age to engage in those behaviors. It also influences their own behavior. We've done some analysis on some of the youth risk behavior survey data, and we have found that if a parent thinks it's wrong for a student to drink, they're much less likely to begin drinking. And I wanted to share with you some other pieces that aren't in the youth risk behavior survey about parental involvement and the relationships to substance use. So this is from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And so if a parent always or sometimes lets youth know that they were proud of something he or she had done, of the students who said yes, their parents let them know that, 6% said they had used marijuana in the past month, compared to 14% who said their parents had not let them know that they were proud of something they had done. And you see similar results for cigarettes, binge alcohol use, and illicit drug use as well. If parents had limited the amount of TV time youth watched television, 5% had said they had smoked cigarettes in the last month, compared to 11% whose parents did not limit their TV time. And so I just wanted to share that with you as parents, you know that the data supports setting those limits, having those conversations with your kids, and you can actually see the results in the data that's collected. So in order for this not to get too data heavy and so that you can hear from our other panelists, I just wanted to share with you one last piece, that if you're really into data and a data junkie, all of the youth risk behavior survey results are available on bouldercountyYRBS.org. You can look at the data that Public Health has posted. The data tables are there, the survey questions are there, any reports are there, and then if you have any questions, you're able to access, I think, the health planner. And I wanted to say that I'm deeply appreciative of the commitment that this community has made to collect this data so that we can track the impact on the health of the long-term health of youth in Boulder County, and it would not be possible without the cooperation of the Boulder Valley School District, Boulder County Public Health, and a host of community volunteers that make collecting this data possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Leisha. Did you want to let folks know, too, where they can access the data?
Did I skip that part?
I don't know, but maybe repeat it because I...
Okay, bouldercountyYRBS.org.
Thank you. And, you know, Leisha oversees the administration collection of the YRBS data for the county, and what a great resource in the community, and what a great opportunity for our audience to ask questions of Leisha and the rest of our panel. If you're watching at home, you have the opportunity to ask questions by simply going online to our website, boulderpsychologicalservices.com, and just clicking on the icon to submit questions, and we will receive them here, and we'll be able to ask the panel. So if you are watching this at home, please take a moment to do that so that we can include you in our conversation this evening. If you're here in our live audience, there are index cards that are going to be handed out for you to write some questions as well to ask our panelists. We encourage you to do so. Our next panelist is Lori Benblatt. Lori is a psychotherapist and art therapist, seeing adolescents, young adults, couples, and groups in her private practice. She's a member of Boulder Psychological Services, the Women's Global Forum, AATA, and is co-founder of the Boulder County Eating Disorders Coalition. Lori is also certified and actively involved with international trauma work, as well as HIV and AIDS work internationally. It's my pleasure to introduce Lori Benblatt.
Hi. I have a lot of information that I feel like could probably cover a 2-hour lecture, so I'm going to try to condense it all into the time that we have. So I encourage you guys to ask questions, as many as you need to after. Thank you, Leisha, for presenting all that information. So you have all this data about all these risk behaviors, and I'm going to try to cover a few more risk behaviors as well as go into a little bit more depth into the ones that Leisha covered. And I think a lot of times I have parents and community members ask why. Like, why do people begin to engage in these behaviors? What contributes to this? What are some of the factors? And I think there's a lot of reasons, and there's never really one answer. Especially in the time of middle school and high school, the brain development is changing really rapidly, so it affects everything. So you look at our thoughts, we look at our actions and behaviors, different emotions that teenagers are going through, peer pressure, family history, other past history, if there's any abuse or trauma, if there's different genetics going on in the family. So I really like to stress that oftentimes it's not one factor, but it's many contributing to it. As Leisha pointed out, that hopelessness and helplessness was the one line in that graph that kind of stayed consistent. And as we all know, our school systems are becoming really stressful. They've already become really stressful for our youth. The pressure for colleges, the pressure to succeed both academically, in sports, with their friends, with their families, I think has largely contributed to the amount of risks that we are seeing. And I'll get to that a little bit later, but stress is a huge factor to look at. When all of these factors are kind of balled into one group, it changes our thoughts, and it changes our thoughts of how we think about ourselves. It changes our thoughts of feeling out of control, of feeling that we're not good enough, of feeling that we can't do it. That on top of the hormonal and the chemical changes that are going on naturally add to a lot of racing thoughts. It adds to a lot of feelings of out of control, poor decision making. We have to remember that adolescents are at a time where they're not really able to rationalize what the outcome of risks are. Our brains aren't really fully developed until early to mid-20s, and just as a little aside, the brains develop kind of from the back forward, and that is where our rational thought is and our abilities to make decisions and to look into the future and, with reason and logic. And adolescents don't have that developed yet. And so I think that when there's an opportunity to engage in a risk behavior, they're not really thinking, well, what is this going to do to me 5 to 10 years from now? And I think that as parents say, well, what's wrong with my kid, and why aren't they thinking about this? They're not always able to think about that. Other risky behaviors that Leisha touched upon, but I'm going to go into a little bit more, are self-harm and cutting, burning, scratching, picking, hitting, head banging, hair pulling. Some people would put that into that category. Self-harm or self-injury happens very often in our community. People would include cigarettes into that, cutting class, drugs, eating issues. And for an eating issue to be considered a risk behavior, it doesn't necessarily need to be a diagnosable eating disorder. A lot of times our thoughts will make us think about food or dieting or out of control dieting before it actually becomes a diagnosable issue. So, extreme dieting, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, those are all under the category of eating disorders and or disordered eating. We're seeing a lot more gaming where technology is, and this is not my area of expertise, but I am hearing a lot of families struggling with how much gaming is kind of taking over the families and cutting out different social areas, It's very isolating. There's also recently more risk of teens looking at sites for pornography and different areas regarding sex, and where they're finding out information that may or may not be true. So those are just some other risky behaviors that I wanted to put out there that I'm seeing, that we're all seeing a lot in this community. So how do we identify what's going on? How do we know that this is going on with our kids? I think teenagers are really good at hiding things, and as we're all really busy, it's hard to always see what's happening. What can be classified as like normal teenage behavior could be a risk or could not be. Teenagers are irritable and they're moody. So it doesn't necessarily mean that something's going on, but it could mean that. Changes in sleep is something to look at. Are they sleeping less? Are they sleeping more? With the increase of school stresses and homework and pressure to do well in school, we're seeing a lot of kids staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning and trying to get their work done. We're also seeing change in sleep if they're partying a lot, if they're taking drugs, if they're using different types of substances. If there's grade changes also is another sign and symptom to look at. Money changes. Are they, if someone's working, are they working so they can buy substances or buy prescription pills, as Leisha mentioned? If someone is engaging in self-injurious behavior, is there a change in clothing? Are they trying to hide scars? Are they trying to hide cuts or burn marks or hitting? Change in affects. A lot of times if someone is going through some of these behaviors, even if it's not substance abuse, although it's often seen if someone is on some kind of substance, a lot of times their affect changes, meaning they can become more irritable, or they can become more depressed or more angry. Sometimes it can be from a trigger that you might not know is a trigger. So quick mood changes and changes in affect. A lot of times when these behaviors are going on, there are a lot of underlying issues. When you're seeing these behaviors, you're seeing these struggles, it's because there's other stuff going on. So some related things are more anxiety, more stress, more depression we're seeing. A lot of times, as in this age, kids are confused. They're confused about who they are. They're confused about what they're doing, what are their values, who are they, what's their identity, and they're comparing themselves a lot, not only to their peers, but to their families. So they're looking to parents, they're looking to siblings, they're looking to their peers to help reflect back who they are. I often hear a lot that, kids don't know who they are. It's a really scary time for kids, especially in times of transition. So into middle school, from middle school to high school, and from high school to college, from college out of college. Those are really high risk times to be aware of. Other emotions are anger and loneliness. Even if our kids have peers and they have a lot of friends, a lot of times they feel alone. They don't often feel like they're understood by other people, because what's going on for them is things are changing so quickly and so often that they feel alone in those changes, where dialogue really helps that, to see, other people are actually feeling the same, or my parents went through this. It makes them feel not so out of touch. When parents are realizing that their kids are struggling with risky behaviors, does not necessarily mean that they've missed the boat. So a lot of times it's really important to have the dialogue with your children from the very beginning. I think a lot of times parents get really scared, and Jeremy's going to talk more about this, but how to communicate with our kids effectively, how to really ask the questions rather than blaming, and how to listen and to talk to them rather than lecturing. I think it's okay for kids and adults to disagree. And to realize that parents are coming from one perspective, teenagers are coming from another perspective, and to really hear each other and have that dialogue, how to have healthy and effective discipline, and how to emphasize how to emphasize a model that what are you showing to your children. I think a lot of times it's easy in families to have someone to point the finger out, and it's really important for us to look at ourselves also as adults, not only parents, but as community members, as teachers, as therapists, as all adults, but how are we modeling for the kids around us? And that includes self-care. If we're going to try to take care of our kids around us, we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. Asking for structure, giving structure is really important, how to limit set and how to give positive feedback. A lot of times, a lot of these risky behaviors are coming from a lack of self-esteem and a lack of knowing who we are, like I was saying. And so how to really work with your teens and develop a sense of self, develop that esteem, develop that sense of strength within themselves, so they're not necessarily comparing themselves to others and saying, I need to live up and be better than this person or to be the same as this person, but to say, I'm really strong in myself and I'm happy in what I'm doing. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Remember, if you're watching at home, you can submit your questions. BoulderPsychologicalServices.com. Just click on the Submit Questions icon, and we will receive them here for our panelists to answer. Our next panelist is Jeremy Dion. Jeremy is a licensed professional counselor, professional musician, graduate school professor, and a parent. He has worked with children, adolescents, adults, and families for the last 10 years in hospital, residential, and private practice settings. He specializes in play therapy for children and working with adolescents. It's my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Dion.
Thank you, Jan. And thank you all for coming. So, in a lot of my private practice work, I'm getting to work with these teenagers who come to me for a variety of reasons. A couple of the most popular include, not of their own accord, of course, but because they're failing with their grades, they're acting out at school or at home, they're getting into legal trouble, either have been placed on diversion, probation, or because the parents are witnessing some of the changes that Lori talked about, either changes in appetite, sleep, overall demeanor, etc. So as I mentioned, most of them are not coming by choice. They're coming because the parents have mandated it on some level. Occasionally, 5% of the time, maybe I'll get a teenager that comes to me because they want to talk to somebody and not their parents. More often than not, they're coming under duress. And what the parents, of course, tend to say is, well, we want him or her to have a safe place to talk, which is great. We can certainly create that. And part of what initially starts spinning for me is what can we also do to help create a safe space for them at home? And how do I sort of work myself out of a job, in a sense, of providing initially this container where things can be talked about and processed and ideas kicked around, but then transfer that back home. I think as I start getting to know some of these adolescents in particular, I start to hear, at times, some of the alarming nuances of what's going on around drugs and sex and many of the risky behaviors we've been talking about. Inevitably, after learning some more about that and what they're doing and what they're thinking about that and how they're getting support, if at all, the subject, for me anyway, comes in around parents and parenting. And are you able to talk to your parents at all about this? How do you think they'd respond? And that almost instantly stops the conversation. They look at me sort of with deer in the headlights of, you've got to be kidding. I would never. Which I think is obvious for most of us to understand, because if I were to share that stuff at home with parents, there would be consequences. The car would be taken away, my privileges would be significantly removed, etc. All of those very logical things, especially from the parenting standpoint. What I try to look for, though, is working with that parent-child relationship to create at least somewhat of a safe condition for there to be some processing space. Because as we know, the kids are going to experiment. We know this on varying levels and to varying degrees. We know at the end of the day when we put them on the bus or give them the car keys and they go to school that they're in charge of their decisions. As much as we would like to be involved in some of them, we gave that up a long time ago. To use a sort of boundary limits metaphor, we know that when we have newborns and infants, we have very tight limits, and of course we're doing everything for them and watching them 24/7. And by the time they're 18 and moving out of the house, in the ideal scenario, it would be nice to have a pretty smooth transition with my boundaries so that they're ready to sort of take on the world, whether they're staying at home or moving on to college. Invariably, between the start of my very tight limits and sending them off on their own, there's going to be lots of readjustments. Two different things tend to happen. One is that I find as a parent that I've held too tightly for too long, and part of my work is to sort of relax a little bit and give a little more leeway. The opposite is true as well, which is sometimes we find as parents that I've gotten too wide too quickly and given the child too much room to get into trouble. So inevitably, it's impossible. I don't even know what it would mean to do this smoothly or do this right. What I do know, though, is that it can be helpful to assess, in a variety of different ways, by talking to other parents and by actually advising talking to my kid. How is this working? Knowing that they're, of course, going to be lobbying for a later bedtime and more freedom and a bigger allowance and so on. Of course, we can count on that, right? But I think being able to have these discussions and set the framework to discuss the difficult things is absolutely key. So a lot of what I do in my private practice work and just work at large is to certainly connect with the kids, to learn a lot of what's going on, but then help look at what the family elements are that are impacting that. Mostly what I see is some sort of breakdown in communication that doesn't necessarily then mean that that's why they're experimenting with X, Y, and Z. It's never that simple, of course, as we know. But what I would like more than anything is knowing that child A is going to be doing risky behaviors, or at least experimenting with them. What I want more than anything is to have that conduit of communication so that they have a safe place to come home and say, guess what I tried? Maybe I liked it, maybe I didn't, maybe I'm scared, maybe I have questions, but I would like that bridge of communication to be there. So how do we do that? In part of that response, or at least in thinking about the question, I look first at what happened to it to begin with. Why wasn't it there initially? And for many of us as parents, it maybe was or wasn't, or we're playing with these different ideas of how to stay connected to our kids. And with adolescents, that's a challenge, right? The primary developmental task of adolescence is to break away. So how is it that we sort of maintain that relationship? I think part of why we don't as parents is we get scared. We don't know what to say, what to do. We remember what it was like for us as adolescents, the things that we tried and didn't try, and we don't really want to be so honest with our kids about some of those things. Part of, if we're willing to really listen, which is I think one of the primary tasks of parenting, we have to be willing to hear things that scare us without knowing how to fix them. And talk about the powerlessness and hopelessness, we often feel that as parents, right? Do I really want to ask those questions and find out that my 13 and 14-year-old is engaging in sex and drugs and drinking and driving? Most of us don't want to hear it, and so many of us don't ask. Or we do ask, and as soon as we get the stock answer, no, I don't do any of that, we're quick to drop it and move away. We got the answer we sort of wanted, whether or not we believe it, right? So part of being willing to listen and being willing to really engage with our kids means being willing to hear stuff that's going to really shake us. I think a lot of us can handle more than we give ourselves credit for. So we do what we do when we get stressed out, ideally, right? We breathe. We even get to say out loud to our kids that scares me. We don't have to have the answers. I think oftentimes part of what breaks down our communication, both in our marriages, in our friendships, at the office, certainly with our kids, is how quick we are to lapse into giving advice. And tell them what you did was right, what you did was wrong, whoosh, instantly shuts down communication in this conversation, and it makes it less likely that I'm going to come to you next time. So we breathe a lot as parents and say, I'm scared. I don't know what to do, but I'm so glad you're talking to me. Can you tell me more? What was that like? Those sort of pieces can be really helpful. One of the pieces that's come up a lot so far in the discussion is around stress. And we know this, right? There's lots of great, wonderful movies coming out lately about the stresses on our kids. There have been tons of studies about the stresses on us as adults, American culture in particular, etc. We are modeling. I think Lori said that really well. Our kids are watching, whether we think so or not, whether we like to think so or not. What are we doing? They know we're stressed. They see us on our phones instead of watching them. They see us making calls and juggling emails and then diapering this one and driving. They see it, right? They feel it. We all get that sense. So how are we managing our stress? Because they're watching. And if I'm managing mine by checking out, by drinking, Every night when I come home, if I have a couple drinks, that's certainly sending a message. This is what you do after a long day. And you can't yet because you're too young, but what kind of precedent am I setting, right? So how am I managing my stress? Am I drinking? Am I vegging out in front of the television? Or am I talking about my stress? And am I doing something that I think most people would agree would be healthy, whether that's exercise, certainly a good one. All sorts of different forms we can talk about for stress reduction, but I think it starts with us at the top. We are certainly setting the precedent and setting the modeling template, but even more than that, if I'm not managing my stress as a parent, there's no way I'm going to be able to be present enough and tuned into you, my child, to A, notice what's going on, and then B, be resourced enough to really be checked in with you, to be able to hold enough space, as we therapist types like to say, to hear. If I'm stressed out and not taking care of myself, I'm not going to be watching you. And if I see some things that are disturbing, like these changes in behavior, I'm not going to want to see them. I'm not going to know what to do. I'm going to be already overloaded, and so I don't want to talk about it. And especially if you're getting good grades now, all is well, right? You get to fly under the radar. That was me as a kid. Sorry to say that on TV, right? I got good enough grades where I could kind of then do what I wanted. Which brings me to my next point about values. One of the things I know is that all of us are making decisions based on what we perceive as most important to us. And the things that are most important to us, we tend to always have the most energy for. We can be focused, we can be disciplined, internally inspired to do these things. They're the things I'll spend my time on, my money on, even if I don't have any money. I've always got a little for these things. The lower we go down on the list, all of us start to procrastinate, hesitate, never get around to it. I never clean my garage. I keep saying I'm going to get to it. But even then when I have a free day, it miraculously gets filled up with fun things that are just higher on my list, right? Makes sense for most of us. So my value system and my hierarchy is going to be different than anybody else's, certainly than my kids, where I may prioritize their grades as a sign of success. They may be prioritizing their social status and spending a lot more time on Facebook and Tumblr and watching YouTube videos and then talking about that as a connection in their social lives, much more so than studying for the history test tomorrow. What most of us, I think, do fairly naturally and without a lot of forethought is to try to impose my values on my child and even my spouse. And as long as they would do what is important to me, we're going to be groovy. As soon as they start going against or challenging my values, we all of us tend to lock down, we want to set limits, we want to set boundaries, and take away cell phone and privileges. Part of the trick, where I'm going with this, is that I think it's imperative for me to be really clear and concise about what is actually motivating my kid. Many parents come to me and say, we're here because my kid isn't motivated, can't focus, and yeah, those are the primary problems. What I already know, because of my practice, I can translate that into is that they're not motivated in the areas that I want them to be motivated in. But here's a kid who can stay focused for 8 hours on their video game and has photographic recall and can tell you what happens on every level and their highest score and their friend's highest level and so on. So they're incredibly motivated and focused, just not in an area that's recognized or valued by me as the parent. So it's a much longer topic in terms of really working with that, but it starts with being able to recognize what's important to my child, and now how do I fit this together to have a helpful discussion, given that my values seem to be in total contrast with theirs. I want them to be putting more of their time into school. They want to be putting it more into friends and the computer. How do we work with that? It's a challenge that most of us are bumping up against, right? What I know doesn't work is for me to just superimpose mine, or at least try to, and say you need to because it's important. I'm missing the boat on a number of levels there because frankly, what they're showing me with their lifestyle and their choices is that it's not important to them, or at least not as important as what they're actually spending their time on, which might be the social stuff. So how do we work with that and integrate it? We can maybe come back around to that after we do these initial introductions. But beginning to recognize what's actually important to them and see that perhaps school isn't at the top and maybe doesn't even make the top 5. And what do we do with that as parents when we perceive that as a big challenge? As we work around boundary setting, right, back to this sort of model, what I know many of us are guilty of is deciding that things have gotten a little out of control and I'm going to set a new boundary. we'll use curfew as an example. Let's say I tried leaving it too late, but all of a sudden the grades were plummeting and they were too tired and so on. So I brought it in and I said, now it's going to be 9 o'clock, right? It's bedtime. What most of us do is really mean it when we said it, but because I've now changed where we were, I've put in new rules, inevitably that's going to be challenged, right? Whether by words from my adolescent or by outright refusal to go to bed at 9, all these different ways. What many of us do is get so exasperated with being tested, or they push the right buttons, or they push long enough that we tend to relax whatever I had just tried to impose. Now, a couple of things happen there. One is that I just lost the game. I gave the child the power. The other is I've reinforced that they don't really have to believe me when I say something. Both of those are problematic, of course. So what I often am talking to my parents about is that I would actually rather you not set any of these limits than to set some and drop them at the sign of the struggle and the challenge. So when you're ready to go to bat and you're real clear about it and you're ready for the consequences of it being pushed and tested and having them say mean, nasty things, hurtful things, whatever they think they need to say to get that to go back to the old way of being, don't set them unless you're really ready to go to bat for them. Lastly, before I sort of close this piece, is I think most of us, again, back with most of our relationships, with our spouses, friends, kids, etc., when things are going smoothly, we tend to just enjoy. And whether we take it for granted or not, but we tend not to make too much of a fuss about it. We don't point out what's going well. But as soon as a wheel starts falling off, now we're all up in arms and getting really excited about that plummeting grade or the joint I found in your jewelry box or whatever it is. But I forgot to catch you doing something right. So I want to make an effort to really notice what you're doing well and what you're doing right and make a comment about it. It doesn't have to be a big flowery presentation, but just something to let them know I'm watching, that I'm tuned in, and that I'm helping to reinforce what I want instead of simply clamping down on what I don't. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Our last panelist is Linda Cain. Linda has over 20 years' experience working with struggling youth and young adults. As an educational and therapeutic consultant, she helps families identify and select appropriate resources such as schools, therapeutic options, or transitional living programs to ensure the student's success. She specializes in learning disabilities, emotional, behavioral, and mental health issues. My pleasure to introduce Linda Cain.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you all for coming. As a parent, of which I am one, there's not much for any of us, I think, that makes our heart stop as quickly as coming to the realization that your child is or has been engaging in a truly risky behavior. It can not only be almost paralyzing to us, but it can make us as a competent adult in every other area of our life suddenly just stop cold and feel completely helpless and hopeless. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some things you can do if you find out that your child is engaging in some risky behaviors. And because I'm not always real good at remembering things when my heart is stopping when I found out one of my children has engaged in risky behavior, I'm going to talk about 4 R's. Recognition, realistic, regrouping, and lastly, responding. And I hope you kind of caught already that the 4th one was the response when you find out. There's a lot of work to do before you impulsively respond. So the first R is recognizing or recognition. I think a number of the panelists have talked about recognizing your own attitude and actions regarding that particular behavior. And I don't want to beat a horse to death here. But are you unknowingly modeling something for your child? For example, if your child is drinking, do you come home and seek out a glass of wine or a beer so that you can calm yourself down to get through the night with your family? If you're not physically modeling something, what's your attitude about a risky behavior that your child is struggling with? Take eating disorders or eating issues going on. Maybe you don't struggle with them. Maybe you don't really care about your own body image. Maybe it's not something that's you think has been an issue in your house. But what are the comments that are going on when you talk to your family or talk to at the dinner table? Do you say, "Oh, wow, you wouldn't believe it. I saw my best friend Louise, and she just lost a huge amount of weight, and she looks so great." Not now she's so healthy, but she looks so great? Do you say, gosh, I really shouldn't eat this because this really just makes me fat? So look at recognize your own attitudes and actions around certain risky behaviors. Secondly, recognize what you already know about that particular risky behavior and then further educate yourself about it. Do the research, get on Google, read a book, talk to a professional, go to a lecture, attend a seminar. There's a lot of information out there today that we can access, and knowledge is power. Try and learn what is fact and what is urban legend. We've all heard, and especially now that we have legalized marijuana, we all know that marijuana can relax you. And I think Leisha mentioned SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. According to them, the fact is that teens using marijuana as little as once a week, let me repeat that, one time a week, double their risk of anxiety and depression. So, is it truly something that relaxes you? Try and recognize what you know about your child's risky behavior. Is this just the beginning of it? Or has this been a problem for some time? What's the scope of it? Is it increasing in frequency? Is it escalating to some degree? Do they hang out with friends who engage this risky behavior? The second R, be realistic. Wishing and helplessness won't change their behavior. I wish my daughter wouldn't self-harm, but I don't know what I can do about it. Denying won't change their behavior. I know my son hangs out with a group of kids that sometimes drag races, but he would never participate in that. Justifying or minimizing it won't change their behavior. I know my daughter drinks once in a while, but she's a good kid. She never gets in trouble, and her grades remain great. Guilty excuses aren't going to help with your child's behavior. She wouldn't do this if she weren't so stressed out by the divorce. Buying into common myths or beliefs won't help you change the behavior. Kids all challenge their behavior. All have risky behaviors and challenging behaviors. But once they graduate high school and move on to college or a job, it always changes. Or I've heard, my kid is just one of those plain unlucky kids. And of course, if someone or anyone is going to get caught doing a risky behavior by the police, it would be him. The other one that is a very common misperception is, if you do get your child help, and the help you get them involves any kind of other kids, they could be with kids that are more troubled than they are, and they're going to learn worse things than they're already doing. The third R is regroup. You need to align as parents. I think Jeremy touched on this, but you need to decide what you are mutually willing to do or enforce. Don't agree to something that you truly are not inclined to support. If you have a child that is engaging in some drinking and you're concerned about it, and you sit down with them and you say, look, I'm going to make a pact with you. We aren't going to drink if you don't drink. Well, if you know that your child's going to be gone Sunday afternoon and there's a big Broncos game, don't think you can hide a beer in the back of the refrigerator and sneak it out while they're gone. It's not going to work. They're going to know. Your child also will intuitively know if you are not on the same page as parents. And they'll use that division, and they'll use every little piece of that to undermine any supports or consequences that you're putting into place. I think a lot of the work that needs to be done around getting your child help or deciding what you're going to do to help your child is so much the background of it. And the piece about being willing to be on the same page and being willing to think through what are you willing to really engage in yourself and really hold the line on. And once you've kind of gone through that process with the child's other parent, you need to construct a carefully thought out course of action for the entire family, not just the child, because it's a systems approach. We're lucky in Boulder, there's almost an infinite number of options that are available to help us. There's different professionals, there's involvement in different activities, there's various therapies, coaching, mentoring, home contracts, formal assessments, support groups, different summer options or vacation options, changing local schools, going to a boarding school. There's outpatient help, inpatient help, specific treatment programs that are available in the nation, short-term intensive help, and crisis intervention. A one-size-fits-all approach should never be considered for your child. What worked for Johnny down the street, even if they were displaying to your knowledge the same behaviors, may not be the approach that's going to work for your child. Any help your child is offered and that you put into place should be based on their unique needs. Remember that you're the parent, not the expert. Don't hesitate to engage a professional if you need assistance, a counselor, a therapist, an educational consultant. Find someone that you trust, that you can work with, and that will help you design a specific plan of action for your child and your family. Don't forget in that plan of action that it should also include supports for other children in the family and parents, as well as the family as a whole. Now we come to the all-important fourth step, which is your reaction. Reaction needs to be appropriate. First of all, sit down and talk with your child about their risky behavior. Let them know that you know about it. Let them know that you're concerned. Let them know this in a loving way. Let them also know that you want to be supportive of them. Invite them to help you and to strategize with you, and then listen to what they have to say. Only then present your game plan to them. Be flexible. If they're suggesting or agreeing to something that will accomplish the same thing that you want to see accomplished, go for it. I don't want to go to a support group, Mom. Can't I just go talk to someone individually? Okay, that'll work. Also be inflexible if they want to completely alter or postpone the plan. Okay, I get it. Just give me a chance to prove I can change. Leave me all alone and just let me work on it myself for a few months. That's not going to work. Be inflexible in that situation. Bottom line, you need to gently but clearly communicate that their risky behavior cannot continue and that you are not going to continue accepting it. Assure them that you will not give up on helping them and that you are committed to doing whatever it takes until they have successfully stopped that risky behavior. Remember, the more your child engages in any risky behavior, the more comfortable they become with it. It becomes their norm, and they begin to own it. Ultimately, it can become their identity. Billy was a boy I worked with who he tried weed the summer before he was a freshman. He tried it once. He kind of liked it. When he was a freshman, he started smoking weed more. In fact, he started using it almost every weekend. Eventually, his use escalated to daily use at school. By the beginning of his sophomore year, Billy not only was known by his friends and the other students, but also identified himself as a stoner. He had completely accepted it. So if you realize your child is engaging in risky behavior, don't be passive. It's never too soon to start doing something. Remember the 4 R's. Recognize your responsibility, be realistic, regroup as parents, and respond appropriately.
Thank you, Linda. Now it's your opportunity to participate by submitting your questions either online or here from our live audience. If you're watching at home, simply go to our website, boulderpsychologicalservices.com, click on the Submit Questions icon, and we'll receive your questions here. I have a couple of questions to start us off. These relate to kids watching pornography on the internet. We got a question from a Boulder viewer that reads, I recently discovered OpenDNS, opendns.com, which can be used to block pornography from your home network. I am not in any way affiliated with OpenDNS. The basic service from OpenDNS is free, does not require any special software on your computer. And she goes on to explain how it works. She indicates that she's used it and it's working great. And she sees this as something that maybe is useful for parents. The question for the panel is, what do you think about that? Is that a good way to go in terms of issues around kids watching pornography on the internet? We had a related question. My teenager was caught looking at porn on our family computer. Help. And we certainly see this. We've seen a dramatic increase in this behavior because it's so accessible to our kids. And this is part of the new age of internet access and all of the information that's available on the internet. So I look to my esteemed panel if anyone has any comments they'd like to make.
So pornography it's an interesting issue because I think that a lot of times people wouldn't, or maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, wouldn't have thought about it as a risk behavior. But pornography affects our brains the same way as other substances do, the same way as exercise can. It increases endorphins. And so it can become just as addictive, I say that with quotes, as over-exercising or as other drugs. And I'm not familiar with OpenDNS, but I think that it is smart to approach it the way you would approach it with any other drug. So being able to limit that, being able to put any kind of structure and limits around it is going to eventually help them to change their chemistry. It's going to not become their identity. It's going to help them to wean off of it if they're already addicted or not become, overusers of it. It's a very tricky and upcoming risk that we're seeing a lot. And again, it is because of technology, and there's a lot of different ways to block things on the computer. Like I said earlier, it's not my specialty, but I know that there's a lot out there that you can do to protect your child from overindulging in that.
I think I would also add that for me it largely becomes a relational issue, or I think can go discussions about the topic of sex, sexuality, and pornography in particular can go well when it becomes a relational issue. And for that, again, for us as parents, it may push some of our limits on our comfort levels about being willing to discuss those topics. In particular, about normalizing the sort of impulses around that and exploring sexuality and going through puberty and those sorts of pieces and being able to discuss that without giggling, of course. The other piece then is to discuss what is it exactly for us as parents, why don't we like that for our kids? Why are we prone to set limits around it? And what is it that is hard for us to palate and is disgusting, and what that might do, the repeated looking at sexualized images, what that does for our relationships, what that does for how we then see other men, other women, and how that impacts relationships. And those things, I think, go well when we can discuss them openly and honestly, which for many of us is pretty tricky.
Just to add one more thing to what Jeremy was saying, is education is key. And we all know that if we don't have education, if we don't know about something, there's a much higher risk of getting hurt by it. So being able to discuss this with your kids, being able to discuss it openly and honestly will help them to be educated. So they will lower their risks of sexually transmitted diseases, of unwanted pregnancy. It will allow them to have more facts and more information so they're not taking risks that are maybe unnecessary. And again, just to emphasize what Jeremy just said, is being able to look at your own struggles with it. Why is it embarrassing? Why is it hard to talk about it? We're talking about with our kids. We might think that it may encourage them to do sex, to have sex or to engage in behaviors at a young age. But really, education helps to prevent a lot of unwanted risks.
I think also another thing, I recently had a number of families come to me who are dealing with pornography, and I think one of the things that I do think it's very helpful to have something like DNS to try and help you as a parent be able to limit that. And I totally agree. I think education is really key, because I think the average parent thinks of pornography as normal sex involved. And there is a lot of pornography going on the internet that involves things like bestiality and other things like that. And so I think it's very important to talk to your child and have a frank, open discussion around the education of, what is pornography and what's the scope of it, and what is your behavior around it, and are you aware of the various types of it and the dangers around the various types?
Here's a related question to consider. How do I advise my daughter about safe sex when I think she is really too young to be sexually active and the parent indicates that the child is 14 years old? So the parent's challenged by the fact that they want to have these conversations with their child, but is wondering about when's the right time to do it. Maybe it's too early at that age. Thoughts from the panel?
As much as I dislike it, I have a daughter myself, it's never too early. What many of us know that are in practice, what many of us know with parents, whether younger children or adolescents, is that the kids are experimenting, and they're going to experiment, and they've always experimented. I would rather them experiment with lots of information that comes from a fairly reliable source. If you're not comfortable doing that yourself and having those discussions, talk to a professional. If you yourself have questions, get some information, get educated. But absolutely, at 14, as much as I grow cringing at the thought of my 14-year-old having sex, those are discussions that have to be had. And they need to be had, for my money, at 11 and 12, if not before. A lot of us now, with the different school systems, these kids have, through activities, through schools, etc., a lot of contact with older kids, whether through older siblings, etc., and with the internet and all of these conglomeration of forces where information's coming faster and at an earlier speed. So we better be ahead of the curve and having, age-appropriate discussions when the questions start coming, maybe at 8 or 9, and where babies come from, or earlier than that, etc. But absolutely, 14 is not too early, and I would dive in there and get information so that I'm ready and willing to have that discussion in a way that can be really productive.
I just wanted to tag on to one of the things that Jeremy said about that 14 is not too young. When we started doing these youth risk behavior survey presentations, I would partner with Lisa Check, who was a substance abuse prevention specialist for the school district. And we came across this statistic that had said, you should be having, if you think there's a certain age in which your child might start engaging in risk behaviors, you should have been having conversations with them about that 5 years prior to when you think they're going to begin engaging in that. So if you think that there's a possibility that at 14 they might think about engaging in sex, then probably you should have had those conversations with them starting when they were 9. And I think that part of the reason that's so hard for parents is because it's really hard. I think it's your discomfort in a lot of ways about having conversations about sex and some of those things when your kids are still really, really young. But I've also noticed, and this is based on personal experiences, the more frequently you have those conversations, your comfort level increases and your child's comfort level your comfort level decreases and your child's increases, especially as they get closer to puberty. But they've been used to having those conversations with you, and so they know that, it's like Jeremy said, they know that you're a good source to go to for those conversations.
Just to tag on to what Leisha and Jeremy said, if you're having these conversations with your kids, they are more empowered to stand up for themselves if they get into a situation. So the earlier you have them, the more educated, again, they are. And the stronger they feel about themselves to have their voice if they are in a situation where they may otherwise not have known how to answer something or not known what to do. They may know what to do in that situation, which could prevent a lot of other, outcomes, which include unwanted pregnancy or diseases that may be lifetime. And so, again, think about this in the way that even if you're uncomfortable, not only you're going to lower your own comfort level, you're also going to be able to empower your child to take care of themselves in the situation that they may not otherwise have been able to. And having that voice in that situation is really hard to find unless you have all of this empowerment behind it, all this education behind that.
One other thing I'd add is that when you take the step and you're brave enough to do something that's scary, like that kind of a conversation with your child, I think if you can say to them, I'm feeling really uncomfortable about this, and it's something that's very scary for me to do, I think if they know that, they're going to be more likely to come to you if something happens and they're very scared to come to you and they feel very uncomfortable. So I think it's a great way to model to your child too.
I think also that when we have these discussions around sex, ideally we're not just giving information about how to have safe sex, but we also leave lots of space for us to register our own opinion that I think you having sex at 14 is a terrible idea. And here's why. Here are my concerns about it. Here's my wish for you, etc. But the message I want to send you is that I'm going to trust you because I know at the end of the day I can't follow you around and make these decisions for you. So here's the information. Here's my opinion about it. And I'm really nervous and scared. But I trust you to make a really good decision.
Our next question from our live audience: how do we as parents improve our communication with our teens without our teens becoming so angry? And while I give our panelists a moment to think about that, keep in mind that all of the presentations that we're providing are available archivally on the Boulder Valley School District website, bbsd.org, and on the Boulder Psychological Services website, boulderpsychologicalservices.com. For example, we gave a talk back in October, How to Talk So Your Child Will Listen. And that whole program is focused on effective communication with your child or adolescent. So if you haven't had an opportunity to see it, it's available for you at your convenience online to watch at any time. Back to our panelists, any thoughts about how we as parents can improve our communication with our teens without our teens becoming so angry?
Yeah, I have a couple. My first is that, while I want to answer that question directly, I think a lot of us as parents and as human beings, just in all of our relationships with our spouses, etc., sometimes make the mistake of thinking that if I am effective in my communication, that it's going to have a certain outcome. If I say things the right way, he or she is going to do what I want, or stop doing the behavior that annoys me because I very clearly asked them to. He'll start picking up his socks because I was so sweet in how I asked. Maybe. But I oftentimes will separate these pieces out, and we look at effective communication techniques. But for me, there's oftentimes a lot of benefit for me to learn how to be an effective communicator, and sometimes I'm still not going to get the outcome that I want. So back to the question, how do I improve my communication without my child getting so angry? I don't know. You may not. But part of it might be actually naming the process in that moment. Wow, you seem really angry right now. Like, what's going on? And then we can talk about that. Well, it's that you never listened to me. It's that right as I was starting to talk to you, you shut me down, and am I willing to hear that kind of tough feedback from my kid? I hope so. And kids are amazing mirrors for us, right? I mean, they tend to do a lot of the stuff we do, and they can, as teenagers, throw it right back in our face and tell us hardly ever where we're great and almost always where we're falling short of their expectations. The other pieces, though, back to some of the stuff that's already been talked about, if I'm doing a nice job with listening, and simply, as basic sort of counseling techniques around reflective listening, you seem really mad, and etc. If I can really let you know that I'm tuned in and listening and get through that initial intensity of the anger, what most of us find is that if I'm able to stay with my feeling for any length of time and breathe, stay present, feelings tend to come and go. If I can hold the space for you to be angry, we'll get to a place where now all of a sudden we're maybe talking about some things that are really important. But I think oftentimes it's a model for us as parents. We all tend to get so triggered around anger. What do we do with our own anger? Oftentimes I want to shut you down because I perceive that you just made me angry, or I need to walk away and end this because you're not having an adult conversation. But can I hang with you and let us be angry and hold on to my seat while we hopefully work through it?
Thanks, Jeremy. And to add on to that, I think what I imagine is that you're already in this situation where your child's trying to talk, or you're trying to talk, and there's already anger there. So it's important to be able to acknowledge that and to be able to humble yourself to say, okay, let's try something different. This hasn't been working. I'm going to try to approach you. I'm going to try to communicate differently. Are you willing to do that? To be able to acknowledge that whatever has been going on, whatever process of trying to communicate isn't working. And so let's try something different and figure out how to try that together. You know, am I listening? Ask, am I doing a good job of listening? Am I doing a good job of hearing what you're saying, doing the reflective listening piece? But being able to acknowledge to your child as a parent that, you know, I'm sorry, I'm learning too. I might not be doing the best job. So please tell me, you know, tell me when I'm not listening, because I want to hear. I want to be able to improve this with you. And also on the idea of expectations, it's okay to disagree. I think a lot of times people get angry when there's disagreements, when you have an idea of how you want a conversation to go, your child has an idea of how the conversation wants to go, and it may not go that way, and you guys may disagree about something, and that's okay. You're supposed to disagree. Your child's supposed to be learning how to think for themselves, how to think independently, how to learn from that. And you may not agree, and it's okay to say that. You know, I disagree with you, and that's okay. And I don't like how you're going to approach this, and that's okay, because I trust you. Like Jeremy was saying earlier, agreeing to disagree is a hard thing to do, and I think it's really helpful in calming the triggers that we often feel inside of ourselves.
In the 7.5 years that I've been fortunate enough to sit in on presentations like this, I've picked up a few things. And one of the things that I've learned is sometimes that anger in a conversation comes from different expectations of what each person is expecting to get out of that conversation. And I think sometimes with parents and kids, you know, if they come to you with something as a parent, the first thing you want to do is jump in and help them solve it, especially if it's something that they're wrestling with, when in reality they may just want somebody to share whatever is going on with them about that. And so you each come into that with different expectations, and so it may not even be a disagreement, it's just different expectations about what the outcome of that conversation would be. So if a parent has the idea that, well, they came to me with this issue, it's my job to help them solve this, whereas the child may come into it and say, no, I just really wanted somebody to hear me. You know, that I think that's a good thing to take under consideration, and that's one of the things that I've had to learn as a parent. And so now I'm like, I ask, you know, do you want me to help you problem solve, or do you just want me to listen? And then if the answer is I just want you to listen, I'm like, okay, I need to step back and temper all my natural impulses in this situation.
I think, too, sometimes the forms of communication can change. I think throwing a curveball once in a while can be a really good thing. So, for example, if you have a child that you know does not do well with transitions, I think writing them something, maybe they're visual, maybe they need to see it, writing them something and saying, you know, tonight we're going to be doing so-and-so, so you give them a little bit of a heads up, even if you know it's something that may not like and typically would make them angry, maybe giving them a little bit of time and space. Another thing I've seen tried and actually be very successful is in the middle of an argument, if you can hold it together to calmly say, you know what, this isn't working. We're going to try something new. I'm going to take a walk and take my phone with me, and let's text back and forth. Now, if you're like me, your kid can certainly text you a lot quicker than you can respond to them. But I think just changing things up sometimes can be a little bit different. And the time and space, you know, you're not looking at each other escalating. And it's easier to say over a text, what exactly did you mean by that? Because, you know, you can read things more than one way. So the only other thing I would maybe add to this is to keep exactly what they said in mind and maybe try a different way of communicating. The other piece I have found to be very helpful is getting them out of their hometown. One of the greatest places to talk to your child and their captive audience is in the car. And if you can do it in a place where there's no cell service, it's perfect.
I have one more comment on that. The other thing is that we don't know necessarily what's going on for our kids throughout the day. So they can have a plethora of things happening to them from the minute that they wake up until the minute that you have that conversation with them that have been built up and built up and built up. And comes out in anger at whatever you guys are talking about. And so maybe acknowledging, is there something else going on? You know, what happened today? How was your day today? How was your day yesterday? Because things build up, as we know, and we've talked about. There's a lot of things impacting our kids today, and it can come out in anger at any moment that has nothing to do with you or what you're talking about. So it's okay to ask. They may not want to answer and they may not want to talk about it, but they may, if they feel like it's safe enough for them to share. Once they're used to that habit, you know, oftentimes they do start to share. But I think recognizing that it's not necessarily you, it's not necessarily that conversation is really important as well.
Question from our live audience. Why do kids have more stress now than 50 or 100 years ago? A lot of us talk about how stress is a major factor in terms of risk behaviors. Do you think that there is more stress? And if so, why do you suppose that that's the case?
Obviously, I think there's a lot of different factors. When I think about, I'm 37, and even from the time when I was a kid, I've seen exponential increase in stresses in the 20 or so years. And we can point to a number of different indicators. Certainly right now there's lots of different pieces happening economically that are stressing out all of us, right? Demographically, things seem to have shifted to where, you know, it's sort of like X number of dollars a long time ago was a lot of money, and now that's sort of pocket change. The same thing is true, it seems, with degrees, where getting your high school degree used to be your sort of ticket, and college was sort of optional, a good idea, but now that's shifted up to where getting a college degree is now sort of the entry-level position, and all these jobs, because the hiring market is so different, et cetera, are that much more competitive. The extreme now pressure to not just get into any school, but the school and the top schools, and now we have the summer programs. We don't just go and fish on Lake Wanamaca anymore. Now we go to like canoeing camp to learn how to be an Olympic crewer. So it seems to be touching on all levels. I think part of that, as a sports fan, happens with our sports and how extreme we've gotten with sports and fitness and the money that's involved there and how much you can make if you're really great and the scholarships. I mean, I think we could look in a number of different directions, but do I think our stress has increased on the kids? Yeah. I don't know that we can argue any differently.
I also think that the requirements for schools have changed. So, you know, colleges are requiring a lot more. So their pressures are a lot more. The schools have standardized tests now that are different than when we were younger. It's definitely different from 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And they're not as, I don't know if any of you guys have heard of Race to Nowhere, but it's a great new film. And they talk about how teaching is now being taught so for the test, not to actually learn. And so the kids are not learning in the same way as maybe we were, maybe our parents were. So not only are the requirements getting harder and stricter, but there's a lot more competition and it's a lot more difficult for scholarship money, and everything kind of plays into it, including the economy. I've also seen this a lot more than when I was younger or than when my parents were younger. I think that with the increase in technology, people are a lot more aware of what is going on in the world, which is really stressful to our kids. You know, it's one thing for us to see what's going on in the world and see all these disasters and environmental changes. And when I talk to a lot of the kids that I work with, they really feel the impact of this because it's their future also. And it's really scary. And I think that kind of gets left behind because we don't realize how much kids are seeing, how much we actually see on the internet compared to what we used to see 20 years ago. So not only is it just the economy and the pressures for grades in school, but it's really the whole global shifts that are occurring that are impacting our kids today.
I think also we're more stressed as parents, and so it just filters down to the behavior and the modeling that we and our attitudes and our actions that are filtering down to our kids. The other thing I keep seeing is so many kids today don't feel good enough. They don't feel worthy. They're not the best soccer player instantly. I had a young man come in who was in 5th grade, And what he really wanted was to play basketball. He didn't want to be a basketball star. He just wanted to play on a team. And he'd actually been told by his school not to go and try out for their team because he hadn't been playing since he was 5 years old. So clearly he couldn't be chosen and he wasn't really that good. And so, I don't want to hurt your feelings, so don't even bother trying out. And I think, today our kids have not the same opportunities to be a kid. And it's okay if you just want to go have a game of basketball with some friends. You don't have to be the best. And if you don't make that last basket at the end of the game, it's okay. If you're trying really hard in school but you're just not getting the A's, it's okay. I think society has put so much emphasis and reward on, quote, the best that failure's not an option. So many kids today feel failure's not an option. And if they feel they can't succeed, they likely just give up. So I think definitely there's a lot more stress on kids today.
Well, and just to say something, I think that a lot more now kids are seeing if they're not the best that it's failure. They're naming it as failure when it's really not failure. We don't have to be the best to succeed. We can do our best. We can enjoy something, and we can really feel like we're thriving and still not be the best, and not call it a failure. But our society a lot of times now is using this word more and more, and I hear people coming in who are getting B's and saying that they fail. And it's, so as parents, how to model that and how to help shift that thought pattern for our kids.
I'll be quick. I just wanted to change the order around. So in talking about stress, we asked high school and middle school students in some youth summits to talk about what that means to them. And some of the things they talked about were family expectations, academic pressures, trying to balance everything in their lives, going to school, being part of the family, work, all of those things that are going on for kids in their lives. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is when we talk about the stress, we've been talking about, I think, adolescence. And Jan might remember this. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to do an informal survey with elementary school students. And I asked elementary school students, third graders in particular, if they knew what stress was. And if they did, if they could define it, and they did. And they asked me, and I said, well, what are some of the things that cause you stress? And they said, well, when my parents aren't getting along, when I have to do my homework, when my brother is bugging me. And I thought those are all some of the same things that we hear from older students. And so I think that stress is also impacting kids at a younger age. And we see that as something that hangs with them as they continue to get older.
I'm going to ask Jeremy to give a quick answer because our time is running out to a question that was submitted by our live audience. Jeremy mentioned creating a safe place to talk. What can parents do to create this safe place?
Thank you. And I hear this a lot from parents, right? Well, I try to ask my kid how his day went or how this is going, and I get a one-word answer. Well, part of that is oftentimes a pattern, right? So we can't exactly rewind the clock. What I would say is try mixing it up. Go and do something. Well, my kid doesn't want to do anything. Surprise him. Pick him up and go out for ice cream with no agenda that we need to talk about this, that, or the other, but just go and do something. To be putting sort of the proverbial coins into the bank by sending that message that I'm interested in you, I want to spend time with you. If you're not going to say anything and I tried a couple questions and you're not talking to me, I might tell you how I'm doing. That I was reading this most interesting book today, and I know you may not care, but I just thought I'd tell you anyway. If I'm expecting them to show up, I better be willing to show up as well. Most of us, and therapists included, I think, tend to get a little lazy and expect that we can just ask questions and ask questions and ask questions, and what do we get? One-word answers, yeses, nos, and sometimes lies. Well, stop asking questions maybe. So make more statements, go and do something, take a walk, go out for ice cream, go to dinner. Again, not so I can get you at the dinner table and now pepper you about your new girlfriend, but just because I want to spend time with you, increasing the likelihood that you might start to talk to me a little bit. And if you tell me something that I think was sort of a surprise, I want to treat it real reverently. I'm not going to go blab to mom or dad or tease you about it later. I'm just going to hold that very special because that was a big deal.
Thank you, Jeremy. I want to let you all know that our next panel will be on Monday, May 2nd, entitled How to Navigate the School System. This is going to be an informative discussion regarding most asked questions from Latino parents in terms of how they can access the school system and be a part of their children's education. This will be a very interesting panel. It'll be all in Spanish, and so please tune into that next month, Monday, May 2nd. I want to thank our panelists, our live audience, our home audience for joining us today, and our partners, the Boulder Valley School District, the Boulder Valley Media Alliance, and Channel 22. You can find out more about all of the BPS community events, as well as previously aired programs, by visiting boulderpsychologicalservices.com. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, I'm making my own way, but I stumble and I falter every day. But I love my baby now. When I love my baby, I'm still learning how. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Stay with me. We'll beat this, can't you see? And wait a while, winter time.